Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, worshippers of all ages, welcome to YouTube. My name is SeaRaptor, and today we've got a first look at Tier 6 Italian battleship, Andrea Doria. Now, the Italian battleships are coming to super test, but they're kind of coming in waves, so they're doing a couple of odd things with this line. This is the first one of these videos, so I'll talk about this briefly to make this, catch everybody up in case you're not keeping up with dev blogs. First things first, most nations have a Tier 3 battleship. Italy will not. Italy's battleship line will start at Tier 4. And at the moment, Wargaming is doing this thing where they're breaking the battleships into like two different test groups. So right now, super testers have the Tier 6 ship, Andrea Doria, the Tier 7 ship, which is Francesco Caracol. I'm gonna butcher that name. I'll get it right when I do the video. The Tier 7 ship, the Tier 8 ship, which is Vittorio Veneto, and the Tier 10 ship, which is Cristoforo Colombo. The Tier 4, 5, and 9 ships will come in a second wave of testing, presumably next patch when everything will be available for testing. So I don't think we're going to see early access to these until about 9.12, which should be right at the very, very end of the year. But while we're here, let's poke around and have a look at Andrea Doria. What's the deal with this ship? All right, so first things first, if this ship looks like a Giulio Cesare, let's assume for a minute that you either own, know somebody, or have played against a Tier 5 premium Italian battleship, Giulio Cesare. So if Andrea Doria looks like a Cesare to you, well, congratulations, you are not far off. Doria and her sister ship were the immediate successors to the Conte di Cavour class, which is what Cesare is from. Start at the top. Survivability, 45,000 hit points. This is good for worst in tier. It's somewhat forgivable with her concealment, and we'll talk more about her concealment in a minute. By comparison, the current worst Tier 6 battleship by health is Tier 6 French battleship Normandy, which has just a smidge over 48,000 hit points, and has actually better aerial detection than Andrea Doria here, a little stealthier, but far worse, like over 2 kilometers worse detection on the surface. So Normandy's got a tougher road to hoe in that she has just a little more HP, but is way more detectable. Andrea Doria here has worst in tier hit points, but also, and we'll talk about this in a minute, she has much better concealment. Torpedo protection there, you see there 32%. That is really, really good for this tier. These mid-tier Italian battleships, and you see this throughout, have really, really, really good torpedo protection for the tier bracket they're playing in. This, hilariously, this torpedo protection kind of slowly erodes over time to where by the time you get to the top end of the line, you don't see this being as good. But here in the middle tiers, these are really, really good numbers. Let's have a check at her armor layout. Now, the armor scheme is similar to Cesare, but it is not identical because, of course, it is a different hull. This 250 millimeter belt here, it's 250 in the center. It's kind of 220 here at the waterline. It kind of tapers a bit, right? Tapers below, tapers through the center. So there's this is the thickest part right here. This is 250 millimeters of belt, but, you know, it's thinner. And yeah, overall, her armor protection is kind of similar to Dunkirk, Tier 6 premium French battleship, which is largely considered a more battle cruiser than battleship. But at the same time, these numbers are not that far behind a ship like Tier 6 premium German battleship Prinz Eitel Friedrich and Normandy that we were talking about earlier. Doria is more vulnerable in the sides than a typical mid-tier battleship, but if you angle this ship right, she ought to be okay. The 26 millimeter extremities here on the bow, the foredeck, the stern, and the stern deck here, that is pretty typical. And then she's got 44 millimeters of deck armor here through the middle here, and then another 38 up here. This is all like, these are actually pretty good values for the tier. These are kind of reminiscent of, let's say, Bayern and Fuso and Ismail, which are pretty stout battleships. So from a deck armor and extremities perspective, she's okay. Belt armor is a little on the low side. Now, I do want to show you something interesting. I got to turn off the bow armor to get in here and see it. You can kind of see it from here. She does have a bit of a turtleback scheme, right? Two things I want to talk about here. One is this angled plate is not built into her citadel spaces the way you normally see it done on, say, German designs, right? German battleship typically has this angled turtleback built right onto the roof of the citadel. Doria here does not have this. This is separate, kind of off to the side. In fact, talking about her citadel, look at this thing. Look how narrow her citadel is compared to the rest of the ship. Look at that, right? It's well concealed. Yeah, maybe it sticks a little above the waterline here, but I mean, look at the gap between the citadel wall and the edge of the ship. Let me put the torpedo bulges back up. Not the torpedo bulges. Maybe this guy. Yeah, that's probably a better way to see it, right? There is a just a noteworthy gap, and it's kind of hard to see. Let me do this. Here we go. You can kind of start to see it now, right? This is the citadel wall, and this is the torpedo bulkhead. Like, there's French space armor, and then there's this, right? Like, there's a cavernous gap in here between her torpedo bulges and this citadel wall, and at least some of it is protected by this angled turtleback plate. I'm actually genuinely curious to run some tests on this ship and see how well all of that fits together. On paper, just looking at it, this ship ought to be pretty tough to Citadel. You ought to be able to get full pens against her fairly reliably, I would think. But that Citadel looks pretty buried in there. That might be tough to get without the right angle. Maneuverability and concealment. Top speed at 27 knots. I mean, Doria's not going to break any speed records here. However, for Tier 6, 27 knots at top speed is actually a little on the high side, a little above average. She is in the top half of all battleships for the tier in this category. An average that is actually dragged down by the existence of not one, not two, but 3 Tier 6 American standards, and of course a couple of plotting British hulls that top out in the mid 23 knot range. We touched on this earlier. Concealment-wise, Doria is best in tier. She narrowly beats out Bayern and Arizona to take top honors in this category. Full stealth rig Andrea Doria comes in, I think, right at 12 kilometers flat, which for a mid-tier battleship is pretty good. I mean, there's probably some cruisers in this tier matchmaking that aren't far below that. In fact, I know there have to be, right? Like, you go look at something like a Genova, right? You know, it's like, ugh, yeah. So, yeah. Rudder shift, turning circle, these are reminiscent of Cesare. In fact, the Doria class and the Conte di Cavour class shared the same overall length and almost the same propulsion. So my gut feel is that driving this ship is going to feel like driving a Cesare, which is good because, in my opinion, Cesare handles pretty well for a mid-tier battleship. But if you're playing Battleship, you're here for the guns, you're all about the guns. So let's look into this main battery here. So the comparisons between Cesare and the Conte di Cavour class do not stop at just Andrea Doria's hull. The main battery is basically a cut and paste job. Doria mounts 10 320mm 44 caliber barrels, essentially the same gun mounted by Cesare. You see here, these are designated 320mm 44 caliber M1936. The barrels on Cesare are M1934, but if you start digging into it, it's the same gun, right? The shell velocities are the same. The AP damage is the same. The AP penetration is the same. It's for all intents and purposes, this is the same gun. So if you're used to the ballistics if you own a Cesare, used to the ballistics there, this is going to feel very, very similar. What isn't the same is that these tech tree Italian battleships are armed like their heavy cruiser cousins. That is to say, they have semi-armor piercing rounds instead of high explosive ones. That's right, we're bringing SAP to battleships now. Now, the mechanics of SAP have not changed from the Italian cruisers, but what is notably different are the shell damage values. You see there that SAP shell does 10,250 base damage. These things are huge. And it makes sense, right? It befits a shell that will most likely land a full penetration and do 1/3 of this damage. It's noteworthy, though, because there are undoubtedly some light cruisers in Doria's matchmaking bracket that she can actually Citadel with these things. I mean, I haven't crunched the numbers and dug into every cruiser hull out there, but they have to exist, right? You see there, I've got 82 millimeters of penetration. There's got to be some cruisers that I could actually reliably Citadel with this SAP, because there are quite a number of pathetically armed cruisers in the middle tiers. I'm really curious to see how this all plays out. We've, SAP on cruisers, we saw the impact it had on destroyers, right? In the sense of highly accurate Italian cruisers throwing, large chunks of SAP downrange, chunking battleships, chunking destroyers, right? Destroyers sailing along and whack, here comes an Italian cruiser, and there goes half or 2/3 of your HP, particularly at the top end of the line with Brindisi and Venezia. So, are they going to be able to do the same thing to, is a SAP armed battleship going to be able to do to a cruiser what an SAP armed cruiser can do to a destroyer. I don't know. The Sigma on these guns, by the way, and this is very constant right now through all these ships in testing, is 1.6, which is not great, right? So you're putting 10 shells into a 235 meter ellipse, and then the shells are not going to cluster towards the center as reliably, as regularly as they would on something like a Cesare, which has a 1.9 Sigma. So the ballistics on these guns are going to feel very similar, but the shell groupings and the shell patterns you're going to get on these guns is not going to feel like Cesare if you own one of those and have driven one of those. Secondary battery. Man, Doria has a lot of secondary guns. Look at this. She's got 4 triple 135 millimeter turrets. It's a very odd armament. And then she's got a lot of these single 90 millimeter mounts. The only thing I can only assume that the reason the range on these mounts is so gimped is because she has so many of them. You see their 3.5 kilometer range on all her secondaries is absolutely terrible. I mean, yeah, these 90 millimeter guns, they have more range as anti-aircraft batteries than they do as surface secondaries. Go figure that one out. If you find yourself brawling in a Doria, you probably will get some good work out of these. The trouble is, you have to get in stupidly close before they'll even begin to open fire. Speaking of AA defense, let's tab over and have a check. Now, Andrea Doria has a surprisingly robust AA suite for a mid-tier battleship. It isn't worst in tier, it isn't best in tier. It's just simply above average, let's say. You see there she puts up four flak bursts, which is very much above average for a tier 6 battleship. But what's going to hamper her effectiveness, you see there, only a 4.6 kilometer range. So when she's dealing with tier 6 carriers, Doria's going to shoot down some planes, and honestly will acquit herself decently, I feel like. Where she's really going to struggle bus hard is when she's up against a tier 8 carrier, because, you know, your flak doesn't start till 4.6 meters. It quits at basically 3.5, and so you've got a very, very narrow window to put up flak bursts in, and tier 8 planes are going to just jet through that, particularly something like an Indomitable that has, you know, super fast planes, or a Graf Zeppelin that has super fast planes. They're just going to, I mean, you're going to put the flak up and they're going to be like, whatever, I'm already through it before it's relevant. So when she's dealing with tier 6 carriers, I think Doria is going to be adequate. When she's dealing with tier 8 carriers, she's going to struggle, especially since, as we talked about earlier with her health pool, she does not have the health pool to survive a lot of consistent aerial strikes. Consumables. Nothing fancy here. You get standard damage control party and standard repair party. These are just the same things you would always get driving a battleship, any other tier 6 battleship. No aircraft facilities on this ship, and she does not get access to the crawling smoke that the Italian battleships do have access to. They don't get that until tier 8. So Doria here at tier 6 is denied that particular little favor. So, just kind of in summary here, there's a lot of things to like about Andrea Doria's hull, in my opinion, right? The stealth and speed give her a leg up on some of her tier 6 battleship competition, and is actually, in my opinion, will probably serve her well when she's up-tiered, as long as there's not a carrier in the game. Her AA suite isn't bad, as we talked about, for kind of self-defense, especially against an even-tiered carrier. I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to how well these guns perform, right? To me, not having driven the ship, not having played the ship, even if I had, I couldn't talk about it. It's just a question of, you know, is the Battleship SAP worth it? We're familiar enough with the mechanics of SAP, but not at these shell calibers and not at these damage numbers. So, kind of like I was mentioning earlier, is an SAP battleship going to be able to do what to a cruiser what an SAP cruiser does to a destroyer? Presumably yes. I mean, I don't know, but one would presume yes. But I feel like the overall accuracy and sigma of these guns is not, it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence on paper, right? So this is really going to have to be a more of a you know, to put these ships through their paces and find out, do these guns go where I aim them, right? Do these shells go where I aim them? I'm really looking forward to trying these out once we're allowed to play them and showcase them on stream. Anyway, guys, there you go. There's your first look at Andrea Doria, Tier 6 Italian battleship. I'll have more of these coming throughout the week for the ships that we do have. Be safe, wash your hands, and I'll catch you next time.